Welcome everyone to TAMA Talks. Today's talk is our fourth and final in a series that happened each Friday in February, and we want to extend a special thanks to Max Presneill, an artist himself, who is also the director and curator of the Torrance Art Museum, who's joined us each week, and we hope will continue to join us as we continue with this series of talks. Today, Max will offer his insight on the work and life of Jackson Pollock, and will answer questions from those tuning in. My name is Janine Madden. I am the TAMA president, and I'd like to thank our treasurer again. She also recommended thanks. Last week, our work on Vasily Kandinsky, she also recommended that we take a closer look at the work of Jackson Pollock. So thanks, Patrice. This talk is being recorded and can be found on the TAMA YouTube channel, which I'll put in the chat. And if you've missed our other talks, or if you've been able to come out, attend them, but you want to share them with folks, then that's where you'll find them, as well as on our website, which is www.tamadvocates.com. Okay, Max, do you want to say anything before we start? Okay, so we are looking today at the work of Jackson Pollock, and I will provide a very short biography of the artist, only because we really do want to maximize the time that we have with Max. And again, feel free, I'm monitoring the chat, and I will do my best to keep my eye looking over there in case you guys put anything in there. I appreciate it. But we would like this to be as interactive as we can. Paul Jackson Pollock was born in Cody, Wyoming in 1912. He was the fifth and youngest son of a family of Irish Scottish descent. Pollock was only 10 months old when the family moved to San Diego, California. His father worked as a surveyor, and which would force them to move repeatedly around the Southwest. When Pollock was 9 years old, his father abandoned the family and returned only when Jackson Pollock himself had left home. He focused a lot on nature and the expanse of land and being outdoors. And while living in Phoenix in 1923, he discovered Native American art. He attended the Manual Arts High School in Los Angeles, where he befriended Philip Guston, and where he was also introduced to theosophical ideas which prepared him for his later interest in surrealism. Two of Pollock's older brothers both pursued careers as artists, and their encouragement lured him to New York in 1930, where he studied under regionalist painter Thomas Hart Benton at the Art Students League. By the early 1930s, Pollock knew and admired the murals of Jose Clemente Orozco and Diego Rivera. Although he traveled widely throughout the United States during much of the 1930s, during the 1930s, much of his time was spent in New York, where he settled permanently in 1934, which is also when he worked with the Works Progress Administration Federal Art Project, and we have a slide on that as well. He worked in 1943 briefly as a custodian at the museum, the then Museum of Non-Objective Painting, which would later become the Guggenheim. And later in that year, Peggy Guggenheim gave him a contract which lasted through 1947 and permitted him the opportunity to devote his time to painting. I'm sure he liked much better than being a custodian. His first solo show was held at the Guggenheim in 1943. In 1945, he married artist Lee Krasner, who we are going to probably do some work on in maybe April. I think we'll do a Women in Art series in April, and we'll talk more about Lee then. But they lived in East Hampton, New York, where their studio still stands on the property today. And I'm going to put a link in the, if I can find it, a link in the chat in a little bit. That's a video of their property there. It's part of their collection of work that they have, and they both actually wound up using that. Using that space. Peggy Guggenheim organized Jackson Pollock's first European solo exhibition in Venice in 1950. And although his work was exhibited internationally, he never traveled outside of the United States. He died at the age of 44 in an alcohol-related single-car accident when he was driving on August 11th, 1956. What I've tried to do today is to show a progression from Pollock's earliest work, to include that work with the WPA, to examples of his last works, and keeping in mind, much like Mark Rothko's work and all of the art and all artwork in general, Pollock's work is best seen in person, up close, and with a great deal of time being spent in front of it to absorb it all properly. I included this slide just again to focus a little bit more on the fact that instead of putting his canvases up on the wall vertically or on an easel, he did work primarily on the ground. And that's just another view of the expanse. Again, this is later on when he started to do the drip painting. So, do you want to start here, Max, with the
sure.
Federal Art Project?
As we're going again, I'll repeat what I've been saying at each of these, which is we're going to be looking at these not as an art historian, but as an artist, and kind of taking some points to think about, I guess. There's some art historical background needed here, though, which is that he worked on, was taught by, I guess, Thomas Hart Benton, who was a very famous American artist, figurative artist of a kind of folk look in some ways. And so obviously with this particular painting we're looking at, there's a long tradition in French painting. You see this kind of thing from Van Gogh, who's Dutch, obviously. But many others. There's this kind of the workers working away in the fields. There are many paintings by early modern artists with this kind of thing, which tied in with certainly a romantic view of nature and working people and some of these kind of things. Now, it's 1935, it says, for the painting. Now, it's really important to remember that the Great Depression had hit in 1929. And so there was a vast amount of labor movement activity. Artists wouldn't, on the whole, would have been not doing so well because paintings are not going to be the first things selling in really hard times. And so it's quite common for a lot of artists to be quite socially aware and to be engaging with some of this kind of things in their artworks. And so this is going to come up later on why this is important, I think. But tying in the social dynamic with art yet again, that these are reflecting political positions at the time, and a unity between workers idea. And of course, this is also this period of the WPA, the Federal Art Project, which was paying people to make murals and paintings to go in offices and all that kind of thing. So it's interesting. This is actually before Pollock was part of that, the program. But I just think it's important to think, right, so you can see directly here, you can see his influences from Benton, and you can see his engagement with what would have been a common engagement, which is with these political positions. But you're also seeing this, and it's important to understanding Pollock's work in some ways, is it has a romanticism about it. This is something that's romanticizing cotton pickers. That doesn't show reality of cotton picking, I think, for those that be picking the cotton. And so there is this kind of strange kind of thing that comes out of a long tradition, I guess, but certainly Rousseau with these kind of romantic ideals. But we'll see this in variations as we go on.
Okay, Max, are you pretty close to your mic? Nellie is saying that your voice is very.
I shall speak louder.
Oh, use your outside voice. Nellie, is that any better? I'm not sure if everybody else. Okay, good. She said thank you. So, there's two pieces here, and I'm not sure which you'd prefer to speak about, or either. Like I said, I put in as much work as I knew we might have time to discuss, and so I can move into whatever you'd like.
I'm really quick about this. Is one of the things that we have to be aware of is that there's no true there's elements of abstract art being developed here and there. We saw Kandinsky doing this and going in that direction, but it hadn't been something popular in America particularly, and hugely influential. It was during the period before the Second World War, which saw an influx of people like Mondrian and a bunch of European painters who moved to New York and started teaching. Hans Hofmann, a bunch of these people. Their influence on American art is enormous because it's during that emigration from Europe with these people getting into the New York art scene that a lot of the ideas that would be more common in Europe at the time became more integrated in the United States art scene, particularly in New York, of course, because most of them moved to New York. But it's really interesting because it gives it a kind of energy burst in which the American artists take and then reinvent, and they reinvent it in certain terms of pushing towards purer modes of abstraction, and they up the scale. And so we can see this. There's like pre-Second World War, and then there's art after 1945, and there is a significant difference. And it's during this period, particularly when these artists are leaving Europe to escape to America, that some of this happens. And you can see it reflected in Pollock's work going through some very, very obviously influenced stages. So if we can jump to the other one.
Yes.
So this is a really, it's a really great example of just where his influences lie. I mean, there's Picasso in there. There's you can see on the right-hand side, there's two bull-like animals. Those, I mean, Braque and Picasso would do those kind of things over and over and over again. You see squiggly shapes and animals that are becoming even more separated from reality in the way of surrealism. And so between Cubist influences and which you'll see recurring in Pollock's work anyway, and ideas about what space are, which come out of Cubism and that lead to the all over kind of field, I guess, of Pollock's paintings. But he goes through a really influential for him surrealist stage. We'll talk about surrealism and how that jumps in a sec.
Good, because I was going to say I know that he didn't. I think it was him, or maybe it was Kandinsky, because now all of these things are melding into my mind. But I don't think he wanted to be considered part of the surrealist movement, but like you said, was heavily influenced by it.
Sure.
Like this piece is very Picasso-esque to me.
Yeah, but you also see an all over kind of look to it, which is becoming Pollock. You know, like seeing it as a field of shapes rather than trying to pick out individual things. It's obviously very surrealistic.
Yes, it's called the Birth, and I'm just going to read what I wrote about it. The mask-like faces drawn from Inuit and Native American art lend an image of unrestrained energy. He was fascinated by the primitive art for its expression of fundamental human fears and desires, particularly as traditional ideas of civilization were tainted by Europe's slide into fascism and war. This is from the Tate show that was up in 2007, and one of the things I'm finding as I'm developing the slides for these presentations is this idea that the people who are writing the labels or people who are writing the articles, I often wonder how they know all of this. Like some of the things that they say. I'm not sure if I'm just becoming more critical about them, or I don't know. I'm not really a big label reader, and so I try to spend more time on the work itself. But it's just a curious thing for me.
You know, I think it's important to always remember that anything you're reading about it is an opinion, and it was
Yes.
Even the artist can be disingenuous or kind of slightly unaware at times about some of the things they're doing. I do think it's important to kind of read widely and interpret. I mean, we interpret artworks anyway. I mean, you can't not do that. And it's a subjective experience then, but it does rely on objective knowledge of, who this person was, what their interests were, where they came from, all these other things that come into your kind of to deepen one's understanding. And so, I mean, so knowledge is power in that sense of knowing more and more about things. But I would be very hesitant to trust anything I read about any artist. And certainly one needs to be aware of some of the belief structures that were around at any given time that are influencing the way that they're being seen. Remember, this is a time when there was an idea of the male genius artist who was macho and just kind of could just do anything, and it came out as this raw power, blah blah blah, and more cliches to go along with it. That's a really questionable position nowadays, and with good reason. I think every aspect of that should be questioned, in as many ways as you can think to do it.
Sure.
But it worries me when because we can tie in several things here. The most important one is following the kind of surrealist lead of his work. He actually went and had Jungian psychology.
Yes, right. Correct.
So he was invested in a belief in this idea that Jung had of archetypes, and there's this shared thing that we all somehow have buried deep inside of us, and that somehow say the art of madmen and children was somehow fundamentally more truthful. These are dodgy as hell ideas, as far as I'm concerned. Children, because they don't know anything yet. And that doesn't mean that they're smarter about the world. They're stupid. They're children. You're there to make sure they don't keep being that stupid. And it's, I mean, they can come up with really wonderful things that aren't, but when people look at children's drawings as an example, and they think, oh, look how creative, they're strange minds. All children go through the same stages of drawing because it's the development of the mind and reflecting how they see the world. It isn't their genius, it's all children do this. And so there's this kind of weird romanticism, again, in Jungian belief that I think played extremely well into the whole abstract expressionist moment, that there was these deep hidden underlying things which were, that had forced people to be emotional and had to come from this deep well of truth, which this is all very dodgy thinking. What the hell is truth in that context? What does truth mean?
Yeah, Leslie commented the collective unconscious.
Sure, but these are like, there is not a single bit of evidence for this. I mean, Jung had his ideas, but none of this is backed up by any empirical evidence or research. It's ideas that he believed, and he took because he looked at what he would have called primitive cultures and said, oh, well, they believed it, so it must somehow be true. Doesn't mean it's not true, but there's nothing there to suggest it is true either. So making a decision one way or another has to be thought through in ways that don't just buy into the whole, way of thinking. I don't think that's a helpful way of understanding art.
Okay, okay. Well, we appreciate that insight. The Moon Woman. So this piece is a Guggenheim collection from the show in Venice in 1976. The Moon Woman suggests the example of Picasso, particularly his Girl Before a Mirror of 1932. The palettes are similar, and both artists describe a solitary standing female as if she had been x-rayed, her backbone a broad line from which the curving contours originate. The subject of the Moon Woman, which Pollock treated in several drawings and paintings in the early 1940s, could have been available to him from various sources. At this time, many artists, among them Pollock's friends, Robert Motherwell and William, how do I say it, Baziotes, were influenced by the fugitive hallucinatory imagery of Charles Baudelaire and the French symbolists. In his prose poem, Favors of the Moon, Baudelaire addresses the image of the fearful goddess, the fateful godmother, the poisonous nurse of all the moonstruck of the world. And I think that you have brought up Baudelaire before. I'm not quite sure. So again, I think the key to understand, I think the key here is recognizing that artists, as distinctive as we think they are, I think are just very heavily influenced by so many, not just artists, but just so many other poetry and so many other artistic things, but and also science, like we're going to see that next week with Basquiat, but and that science connection. But yeah, I find that very intriguing.
Yeah, I think this is a great pairing here because you can see that there's a kind of familiarity of line in here. The paint application is very different, of course, because things have moved on or moved around and changed in where Pollock was at the time. But the influence is heavy, and you can see the influences of the surrealist elements that kind of surround the figure.
Is it time to talk about that yet?
I think that what another thing we need to kind of be super aware of is that there was a schism in the surrealist movement at one time. They kicked out Dali, for instance, and one of the causes of the schism, as it were, was that they felt that Dali was kind of faking his unconscious, which he might well have been. I mean, Dali's a fascinating and somewhat unpleasant character at times. But he's an odd character. But the reason why he's kicked out was because the surrealists were heading increasingly towards an idea of things like automatic drawing.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that because I was reading about it as I was preparing, and I didn't know, like, what is it, automatonics or it's not automation, but say it again.
Automatic drawing. But
yes.
What that basically means is that you let yourself just like essentially doodle, and that is a conduit between the mark making utensil and the unconscious mind. And so that in doing this, somehow something will be revealed, or at least it will be a direct expression of the mind without being controlled by logical thought or outside influences. Again, something that one should question. There is some connections in there that are interesting. I think with, say, doodling. Doodling is a really odd thing that human beings do, and I'm not, why do they do it, and what does it might mean? Please feel free. But I think what we can see in that logical extension is abstraction, pure abstract expressionism, because that kind of doodling is what Pollock essentially does large scale. Now, you mentioned earlier the American Indian influence. That putting stuff on the floor was influenced by the sand painting, and
Okay.
big areas. He was also influenced by Mexican muralists in terms of scale, so that you would lose yourself more in them. He could move around these things and get to them, which is often also why they're like this, because you could get to the center. You get too big, you can't reach the center anymore of the painting without walking all over it,
Right.
which would work very well with his painting. So I think that there's a very obvious bringing together of these elements, a fusion going on, and then suddenly he gets to that point where he's making Pollocks. And I think that's the moment where you see some changes, like it's not one for one, it's not literal, but that as a periods of time where he starts numbering his canvases instead of giving them titles, so that you're not distracted by a potential title as a meaning. So he numbers them.
And is that different than saying that something is untitled? Does it serve the same purpose?
Untitled, yeah, it's a good question. Untitled is a really weird art phenomena that it's used by different people for different reasons. Sometimes because they haven't got, sometimes because they don't, they're smaller works, but sometimes it is a way of avoiding the pitfall of having associative meaning.
Okay.
Pitfall for some people. I personally, I number mine.
Okay.
I do it for the similar reasons.
Okay. Okay.
You can still see, the bull in there, yeah?
Yes, here.
The she wolf. You can see the head
But
on the left-hand side, and I would suggest that this is obviously Romulus and Remus she-wolf.
oh yes.
Which is interesting because he's still messing with mythology.
Yes.
And this idea maybe of Jungian archetypes and how that connects through history, etc.
The twin founders of Rome. Yes.
Founders of Rome, exactly. It has those elements, again, that connect to that surrealism. And this period is he's starting to break up. You can see, if you guys are not familiar with it, Picasso did a series of bull paintings that got increasingly, bull drawings that went from a drawing of the bull to literally just like a couple of swipes of a pen in the figure to make this bull. And this is obviously been, Pollock has seen it and taken this on board. Everything about this screams Picasso.
Is it the Chen? Janine, do you know that? Is it the Chen Art Gallery in Torrance? They have they had, and I'm not sure if they still have them, they probably do, a huge collection of the drawings that Max was referring to, those bull. Did you see that? Did I see that with you? I saw it before I left.
Yeah, it was all those prints that he had.
Yes, like hundreds of them. It was amazing. So, yes.
They're really interesting examples of how the mind can move towards abstraction. There's a thing in the world, and then you're breaking it down to kind of base elements. What are the least amount of marks that will tell you somehow that this is still a bull? I think that it's a really interesting progression of seeing how the mind can do that. And we can see it in Pollock's work as he moves directly towards that. These kind of marks that are surrounding are becoming purely abstract. They're not relating to anything. They're not using symbolism. They're not surreal. They're just marks.
I included this because it was the first work by Jackson Pollock to enter a museum collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1943. Okay, so this next piece is called MURAL. And it was commissioned by Peggy Guggenheim. He was an unknown artist and procrastinated for months and completed it the night before she wanted it, I guess. And the documentation I have here said that it launched his career as a leading artist in the then emerging abstract expressionism movement. Pollock described the work as a stampede and compared it to, quote, every animal in the American West, cows and horses and antelope and buffaloes charging across that goddamn surface. It's the quote that I have here. And the comment on a video that I can put in the chat on the restoration of this piece was that, and I find restoration in general really interesting, maybe because I'm a science girl at heart, but they use so much kind of technology to look at the pigment and determining what the pigments were and how they were mixed. And I find that part fascinating. So I'll put a link to that video I watched on the restoration in there. But the idea that he completed it the night before she wanted it, and the fact that it was in oil and took a long time to dry.
You know, it's a really good pick to use, because it does give a really, really good example of a couple of things, which is the influence of the Mexican muralists on scale. It's called mural, but I believe it was actually done on canvas and installed. It wasn't put, I don't believe it was done directly on the wall, and I think that was at, if I remember rightly, at Duchamp's urging. But anyway,
yes.
But I think it's also interesting that we're now saying, well, this is where, amongst other artists, Americans grab the idea. They look at Mexican muralists and others and say, scale. We're going to be building bigger. And that allows the rhythm of this kind of artwork to really play out, where the body can get lost in it a little bit, but you can, it's wide enough or large enough that you can really see these repeating rhythms, which you'll see in essentially all of his paintings have those.
Yes, we're going to do blue pulls in a bit. And that's the part I think that's so fascinating, is because I think that oftentimes when he made this move, which he's going to be in a minute, a few years, to the drip and splatter painting, there's still a method to the madness, you know. But I think that I'm drawn to this particularly because of, number one, the color, but also just the rhythm of it. I find it to be very soothing. I know it's rather erratic, but I really like it. And so you made a distinction there earlier when you said murals. So murals are then typically done directly on a surface. Is that the distinction you were trying to make?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, it was for her. It was for her apartment.
There's a tale that he was drunk. It might have been in connection to this at the party at Peggy Guggenheim's apartment, where he was drunk and he peed into her fireplace.
Oh,
that could be very true. It's something I probably should have included more of, but yes, he did struggle with alcoholism for.
He was an alcoholic, and he died drunk in a car crash.
In a very violent car crash that I'm not sure it was if he killed. He killed his. There were two women in the car with him,
and one of them was there were two women, and one of them was his lover.
Yes, yeah, and she lived. I have to look that up. So here we are. Okay, so this was 1943. Now we're in 1945, and I don't have a lot of historical information on this piece. This is very, to me, like I see Jean-Michel Basquiat in this piece, and maybe it's just from a line perspective. I don't know, but
so maybe I think I see what you mean. I'm wondering if that's to do with because it's essentially a drawing. Basquiat drew mostly.
Yes.
And this is much more of a drawing than it is a painting.
Yes, and there's a lot of line and a lot of layers. And I included these sculptures because I think one of the things I wanted to, and I put a little blurb in here about the sculpture, but one of the things I wanted to include is the fact that many artists are work much like yourself, kind of work across, even though that they primarily do painting, they do also work in other media.
I'm really glad you included this because I had no idea he made sculpture until these. I had no idea at all.
It says his Pollock's, and again, I'm taking what you said earlier with a grain of salt because, you have to kind of question, almost not question, but critique everything you read. Pollock's long-standing interest in sculpture, while writing to his father as a 20-year-old in 1932, he had expressed a preference for the form, saying, "I'll never be satisfied until I'm able to mold a mountain of stone with the aid of a jackhammer to fit my will." I guess that during this time is when Mount Rushmore was being created. It says, at this time, Pollock carved a small black basalt head, a death mask with closed eyes. His painting teacher, the muralist Thomas Hart Benton, got his students to make small plasticine versions of the figures in their paintings. Most of Pollock's subsequent sculptures, there are about 12 known, and they are like miniaturized 3D incarnations of his drip pictures made from bent wire, plaster, and paper mache. The spirit of sculpture even informs his intensely physical painting methods. He worked in a barn with a vast canvas laid unstretched on the floor, crouching over it, approaching from all angles. It echoes traditional images of the sculptor crouching over a lump of stone, carving in the round. It says one impetus. Okay, I didn't know. I typed it, but one impetus for his late experiments with sculpture may have come from the publication of the first book about Picasso's scarcely known sculptures in 1949, which created a buzz around the idea of painter sculptor. And so I didn't know Picasso did sculpture either.
Oh, yeah. You know, he essentially invented assemblage art. He was the first artist to seriously use collage, and he was the first artist to seriously use assemblage.
Picasso or Pollock?
Picasso.
I wish Sam were on this call. She couldn't make it today, but I know that she has a background in sculpture too, so it would be good to ask her some questions about this also. So here we are with a fairly, so if you saw this, if you were in a gallery and saw this, then you would probably kind of migrate over to it, recognizing that it could very easily be a Pollock, only because it seems to be what we associate with him, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to include that earlier work, because I do find that I'm very intrigued by that idea that that your early work can be so dramatically different. And yesterday was either, I think it was yesterday, last night, the Frist Gallery or the Frist Museum in Nashville has a Picasso exhibition on, and they did a little walkthrough with everyone last night, and they included a bathing painting of his from early on in his career that, had you looked at it, you would really never know it was done by him. Okay, in 1947, Jackson Pollock arrived at a new mode of working that brought him international fame. His method consisted of flinging and dripping thinned enamel paint onto an unstretched canvas laid on the floor of his studio. And you see here too, as Max was saying, a digression from actual paintings to numbering the paintings, which I find interesting, is that the actual name of this painting includes the year it was done. And like, go ahead.
If you look at the top of that painting, it's kind of a blanker area, which reappears in various ways around the corner. And when a lot of where abstract expressionism went was towards this all over, but this is centered on the canvas, which sees the activity going on as being, you know, located as opposed to all over, which kind of philosophically, if you like, extends beyond the edges of the canvas. Because if it's, you know, if it looks as if it should go on beyond it, there's it's an extension into space, an extension in time suggested there. Yeah. If you keep it to the canvas, it's a moment. If you take it to the edges, it implies extension. Now, one of the things that's really interesting is that Pollock, and particularly because when you guys are all familiar with the film of him walking around the painting and splattering and dripping by Namath. But what's kind of interesting about this is not only is there this belief that you have to enter into the painting, lose yourself in it, but something that's become very important later on in art making often is that it becomes a performance. And
yes,
in it becoming a performance, what that says is that the importance lies in the moment of making. It's the act of creation. You can argue about what the creation is exactly, but what we're seeing here is the remnants of an act of creation. And that is a performance. And I think it's really interesting because when later on, even today, we talk about performative painting, and what we're actually saying is, when we talk about that, is the importance lies in a direct experience that we can witness. We're witnessing the documentation in some ways. And why that might be interesting is that, like watching a performance, and you see some photographs later, the photograph is not the performance, it's documentation. And so in some kind of sense, you could argue that this is documentation. It's not actually the art. The art is what Pollock was doing when he was moving around, flinging paint, and that this in some sense is documentation. And is there some kind of gap there between, when is a painting not performative and when is it not a documentation of a procedure or an act of creation? I don't have the answers to this, by the way. It's just one of those questions that come up about painting.
And I'd be interested to hear what people think about that, because so locally with the Destination Art, I think Ron Squared. So Candy knows the name of one of the guys. I only know Ron. I think it's Hust or Hust, H-U-S-T. Janine might know too, but and Susan might know because they paint at the Marsh a lot, but they are Pollock-esque, thick, impasto. It's yes. What's the other guy's name? Ron Lebrecht. Right, Ron Lebrecht, the APC Fine Arts guy. So I love going to see them because I just love watching them work, and they work. What's interesting too is that they work together on the same canvas, which is fascinating to me. But their work is very, very, and so I guess my question is, their work is very, very performance based. And so my question would be then is it only performance based if someone's watching you do it?
Well, I think the word when it doesn't imply an audience. It implies where the import, the intent lies, and for that kind of thing, where the real art is in Pollock's actions, which was action painting, whatever.
Right.
The actions. It doesn't. It's because what the abstract expressionists is, number one thing is, the number one most important thing is the nearest thing to the sublime is the act of creation. It's not
not what they create.
It's not about the art object. It's about of humankind, willing something into existence, fighting against the abyss and nature and everything else, or at least unleashing nature from inside to bring into the world, give birth to this thing. And there's a whole mythology built around this idea. This is this moment, it's godlike, it's, these are geniuses at work, distilling from nothing the elements to, I find it's really difficult because it's so overblown as a way of thinking. It doesn't mean some of that isn't true. I mean,
is it the artist as prophet idea that you're talking about?
To a large degree, I think that's true. And, I think some of the things we need to also quickly kind of put this into place with, so we don't lose sight of them, is the amount back then that critics had a serious influence in the art world. They don't so much anymore, but back then they did. And Clement Greenberg was one of the most influential. and Harold Rosenberg was the other one. They were hugely influential critics. And Clement Greenberg, saw Pollock's work and just was, this is the logical outcome of my theories. And so supported him. I mean, immensely egotistical, of course, because it's all about his theory and how artists best illustrate his theory. But he's a very, very smart writer, well worth, again, different time, different ideas, but certainly if anybody has an interest in reading Clement Greenberg's writings, absolutely read that. They're really an interesting take on what painting should be and can be, and a kind of a set of ideas about where it might lead, which is eventually going to lead to color field paintings, because it's about nothing but paint. It becomes, this is important because it becomes the bedrock for minimalism. It is what it is. It is not about anything. It doesn't tell you anything. It is exactly what it is. There in the world, this thing. And that was the outcome of Greenberg's kind of position. And it led to those color field painters. And in real terms, I mean, in long term, it led to a longer term, led to the roots of minimalism in art. So I think there's some, you see these things building and building on each other constantly. Nothing ever quite stops, and often artists are reacting against.
I'm skipping through some of these because I want to address the, we'll talk about convergence, this piece, but I want to talk what you just mentioned about paint. And I think one of the things I keep coming up in is this migration from art paint, artist paint and pigment and tubes or whatever, to using house paint and using enamel and using more non-traditional, not only non-traditional methods of applying the paint to the canvas, but also just non-traditional paint. And I know that I know in your own work, you use lots of like spray paint and other kinds of things. How important do you think that movement away from traditional paint is, if at all, important?
I actually think it's not important at all.
Okay.
The reason being is because they're just tools. I think artists that get obsessed with their tools are missing the point. A brush is a brush. You might have an expensive and nice one, and everyone has their favorite brushes. There's something about them, you like the size and the way the paint goes on. But to get obsessed with it is like a mechanic not fixing your engine because they're spending too much time talking about spanners, and wrenches. Gotcha. And really, I think that often some of those changes are led by necessity. House paint is cheaper than artist paint. I think that they're sometimes led by the necessity of how they react. Like he'd use sticks because sticks drip well, and you can find them anyway and get lots of them, throw them away and get another one. So sometimes I think it's necessity and price and stuff in the beginning. So I do think there's elements of it that, which can be seen as trying out new technology, new types of paint, acrylic paints. For instance, it was his generation that started using the first acrylic paints. Normally, that didn't last for very long. They didn't wear particularly well, as anybody knows Sam Francis's work can attest, because they fall off the canvas. The paint falls off the canvas all the time, and it's a nightmare for the owners because they have to have them constantly fixed. But I wouldn't put too much. I mean, people make it. Like articles will make this thing about it. And most artists, I think, will use whatever they have to get the result they want. And if it's fingers and brushes or pouring or splattering or dropping from a great height, whatever you need to do to get to where you think you're going is perfectly acceptable.
When you spoke earlier about assemblage and collage, this piece, Convergence, it says, among the interwoven skeins and stains of pigment, objects such as nails and coins can be found on the surface. For example, a small match is embedded in paint near the center of Convergence. So that idea of, just what's there to be included in the work is exhibited in this piece.
You know, I wouldn't want to, I don't know this, but there is in this time culturally, there's this idea of growing of ideas about Zen Buddhism and all these kind of things, and John Cage's experiments and whatever, where people will talk about chance elements. And chance elements has twofold meaning in some ways. One side of that is indeed stuff happens, but you make a decision whether you're going to leave it. And if things fall into, say you drop your match, because he was a smoker, he used to smoke while he was painting. You know, if a match drops into the painting, it happened by chance, but you make a conscious decision to leave it there. And that tells you, yes, that this is an event. It's an ongoing fluid event where the world is interacting, and here's some of the elements of the world that got onto the canvas. So it's all, leaving them there is an acceptable way of reinforcing some of those elements about what people believe is happening while Pollock is painting. So yeah, anybody that's been a painter has had things fall onto the surface of their paintings. A very typical one is you're brushing away and you see one of the brush hairs is still in the painting. Mm-hmm. You have to make a decision, you know, because it has a meaning. If you leave it, it might indicate this. Or do I remove it because it's interrupting what I'm trying to do, which might be, say, a very flat color. But stuff like that is a decision-making process that does have meaning, but is very, very typical for all artists.
And different than, I would assume, like in some of your own work, where there are elements that are, you know, three-dimensional, non-paint art objects that are included intentionally.
Well, yeah, there's because the argument I would use would be more akin to a Cubist argument that you're reintegrating real life, whatever that might be, into the painting, and so it has a more direct reference and meaning that really, you know, that puts it back into outside of the artwork's life into the real world in some ways.
Okay.
Can I just mention that one of the things that made that really made a huge impact on the abstract expressionists and really made Pollock a household name is one, he was in an article, I think Time magazine maybe, that asked, is he America's greatest living painter? Which is, you know, wow, fantastic. But that comes about because of people like Guggenheim, one of the best known, biggest collectors in the entire world, has a lot of media contacts, a lot of influence in culture. He has Clement Greenberg supporting him, the most influential, one of two most influential critics of the day. He has Lee Krasner, who to some extent had given up her career, the kind of ambition for her own career, to support him and to push him and to introduce him to people, etc., etc. So there's all these forces that are coming together to support him and to place him into that position. And the name of film, of course, helps because everybody's like, oh, wow, look at him move. Because otherwise, you don't know what painters look like when they're in the studio. You don't even know what most of them look like. I mean, if I named some of my favorite painters, I bet nobody here knows what they look like. And you wouldn't recognize them if they're sitting next to you on a bus. Even I wouldn't. I don't know what some of my favorite painters look like. And so some of this comes together to kind of push. But what I think that when I was young, and first reading about all this stuff, there's a bit of a rumor going around, turns out it was true, but the CIA put money into touring abstract expressionist works around the world, including to Russia. It was a big conspiracy theory when I was a kid, but it's actually been well documented and confirmed now. It's no longer a conspiracy theory, it's true. And the reason why they did that is because in the Cold War, they used American art, large scale, brash, dynamic, for the future, and free. And so there was a huge push by the American government to use their abstract expression artists to reinforce the idea of American freedom, which is brilliant because the work, of course, is totally talks about how the artist has to be free, he has to be able to just do whatever the artist has to do. And so in terms of linking it to a wider cultural drive against communism, it's perfect. Although politically, a lot of the artists would probably have taken the communist side of the argument in reality. But I think
would they have seen it as propaganda to some degree?
I no, because at the time I don't think any of the artists were aware that that the backing was coming from CIA. I mean,
I
this all
see.
came up over a period of years.
I see. Yeah, you really don't know when
Yeah,
when it's happening.
well, we talk about all these influences that go into making the work, but to make somebody a success is not the genius and brilliance of the artist. It's a structure called the art world of support, and it needs all of these various elements. Because I'm sure there are artists out there who are just so fantastically talented, and we'll never really know because they don't have those contacts. They don't go out and push. They don't get themselves in the right places. They don't have support. Maybe they're difficult and people don't want to work with them. All these things can help not make it happen.
Sure. I think music, musicians have the same issue. Actors have the same issue. Everybody, I guess, if you're trying to make your way. We have just a few minutes left, and we're finding each week that we could talk so much more about so much of the work. So what I'm going to do is go through the last couple of slides. But as we do, feel free to chime in or put anything you want to ask in the chat. If you have to leave, yeah, Leslie put a few links in there. Max put a link in about the Ed Harris movie, who really is my all-time favorite actor. So but I have not seen the movie, so I need to watch it.
It's really, really good. I mean,
I like him.
He's got Pollock down, just like channeling him. It's amazing.
Well, good. I will definitely watch that. I included Blue Poles only because not only, but I find it to be a kind of an amalgam almost of that earlier, of the work in the late 1940s, where he was doing that very rhythmical replication pattern work. But this is sort of a combination of the splatter drip plus the lines. This piece I included because it was rather controversial at the time. It was purchased by the National Gallery of Australia in Canberra. And I was there several years ago, and I feel like that I saw this, but I cannot imagine that I didn't take a picture of it. And so all I can think of is maybe they didn't allow photography. But it was sold for $1.3 million. And the gallery's director at the time was not authorized to make purchases over $1.3 million. And so the prime minister had to approve it. And this was back in 1973. And so the people were sort of in an uproar. The Australians were in an uproar that so much money was being spent on this one piece. Obviously, years now, the amount of people who come to the museum just to see this piece, I'm sure has, I'm not sure if it's exceeded, but 1973, you would hope that it has exceeded the purchase price, but it really has been quite a draw for them, but it created a scandal at the time.
Just to kind of finish off, towards the end of his life, before he died in that alcoholic car crash, he became unsettled, I guess, unsure of himself and about what he was doing, and kind of returned to the surrealistic aspects of his painting. So an interesting question, of course, would have been, what would his art, because he's only 44 when he died, by the time he was in 50s, 60s, 70s, presuming he'd lived, it's an interesting question about where his art might have gone, because he'd already seemingly left that kind of all over painting that he's known for, left that behind. And because he only did that for a very short period of time. So yeah, it would be, would he have been forgotten again? Again, would he have been forgotten as somebody that just had this brief moment? Or would he have somehow grown bigger taking chances again? I don't know.
And I think we have that feeling about many artists. I know we'll talk about it next week. I read a good article about Basquiat and how his work has sold for such high dollar amounts, but would anybody have paid that while he was still alive?
Yeah.
Or in the very beginning stages of his career? And the same with so many other artists who are basically, non-entities, but have ultimately become huge huge collectors, people who are collecting, have quite a bit of their work in their collections.
You know,
This is
you guys tune in at these each week. You need to be more vocal. You need to be interacting a little bit more, I think.
Yeah, feel free. Like I said, we love the idea of people tuning in. It's great. Also, definitely want to thank those folks who suggested some recommendations for next month. So we'll finish up with this last piece because I know it's late. This is this website indicated that this was actually from The Guardian, an article in The Guardian, and I really wanted to, I'm going to include it because I thought it was really, so I'm going to put it in the chat. I can do two things at once. So his late imagery is suggestively and surreally figurative rather than clearly narrative, except in the case of what has been called his last major work, Portrait and a Dream. Featured at the Tate, it comprised two distinct parts, like a diptych. The left half, The Dream, is a squarish skein of poured, squirted, and black lines, within which we can discern the fragmented lineaments of a reclining female nude with a multi-layered spiky head at the top right. Pollock's long-suffering life, the artist Lee Krasner recalled him saying that the top right part was the dark side of the moon. Traditionally, the moon is a female element, invisible at night, the time for sex and dreaming. He was fascinated by the analytic readings of symbols, and as Max mentioned earlier, kind of delved into that psychoanalysis at one point in his life. So there's more. The 1953 self-portrait is lacerated with patches of whiskey orange and yellow, suggesting smoldering passions barely held in check. Here, however, the side of the face and eye nearest the moon woman is covered by a bulbous Picassoid growth that completely masks it and which prevents him from seeing her. Yes, sorry, Max. Yeah, so Lee Krasner was his wife and an artist in her own right, and we'll talk about her. She'll get her own TAMA talk probably in April. But yeah, this article, there was a very woven sexual tone throughout the whole article. And as Max indicated, the crash in which he was killed, he was with his mistress and another woman. So, all right. I'm gonna end. There's Max. Thank you so much. We really do appreciate it. Next week, as I mentioned, we will be featuring the work of Jean-Michel Basquiat, and the invitation will go out shortly. We have all, March is filled now with all of the TAMA talks for it. On March 10th, Sune is going to join us, and she is the assistant curator at the TAM, who's going to give us an update on what's happening and what's coming up, and a little bit of a behind the scenes look at the curatorial process at the TAM. And I decided to make that a members only talk. So again, we always, the original intent was to provide these so that members could get back into the museum in a way. And we are also looking to increase our membership if we can. Leslie, where are you? Give us a wave. Leslie has very sweetly volunteered to step up and provide a retrospective on Ellen Gallagher on March 19th. So we're very much, you're on mute. We're very much looking forward to that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We're looking forward to it. I have an Art 21 link to send you. She was featured today on that. I don't know if you've seen it. I'm sure you have. And then on March 26th, we'll be discussing Bay Area mid-century artists who shaped the art scene at that time. And Sam Richardson and TAM docent Ann Weber will be joining us, and will give us some input for that session. So March looks like it's going to be pretty cool. We're excited about it. Anything to add, anybody? Thank you so much for all the comments.
Thank you.
Sure. Anything about the work, any slides you want me to go over?
The
You
one
guys
thing,
would be great if I was a teacher. Go ahead, Janine.
just the one thing that I noticed in all of his paintings was the palette was similar almost in everything. There's absolutely no green that I saw, for example. It was all kind of like that Payne's gray and blue and the black and some yellow, a little red, but that was about it. I think all through his career, it seemed.
Yeah, I think palette is an interesting thing. I'm a big Frank Stella fan, and so I noticed that there's a lot of the same use of color.
You know, colors literally go through cycles of popularity. You can, to some degree, you can date a lot of artworks just by the colors they use. Like you can in furniture or car design, you can see certain colors like that Lincoln green, you know, late 60s, early 70s. You know, it's very, it's a really good point, well taken, because it's something that gets passed over a lot without paying any attention to it. But one of the things that's really interesting is if you do a lot of studio visits with artists, if they're younger, they're often influenced heavily by artists from quite a long way back because they're not necessarily familiar with a lot of current artists. And say they're at school or something, and all their classes are telling them about, you know, pre-Second World War art. Maybe they're discovering, you know, the abstract expressionists in their classes. And you can see these colors being used and they get kind of used to it. And one of the things that happens in studio visits, you have to point it out to them, say, you're using a palette which is dating your work. You know, what's the palette of your time? What's the palette of your culture? What's the palette of, you know, you and your friends? And it's an easy way of kickstarting this way of thinking, oh, even the color choices matter, you know, in what I do, because they're not neutral. They have, you know, echoes, as it were, and meaning.
Thank you.
Thanks, Janine, very much. Some of the work I'm doing on or learning about color and color theory is just this idea of the ability for artists. Some artists are better at blending and mixing color than others. And so, I mean, at the end of the day, you have 3 colors to make every other color with a black and white. So do you think a lot of that palette is influenced by their ability to mix?
I think it's a
Create color.
From him. It's ability to buy, because he didn't do too much mixing. I mean, most of this is directly from a can.
Right, but like when you were saying about new artists, do you think that do you think that has anything to do with it at all?
Well, you know, you know, logically, yes, all colors come from a very few of them. That's not actually how it works at all with real life paints. You can't, there's a lot of colors you cannot reproduce by mixing. I don't care how many by hand that you're doing. You know, you can't mix fluorescent pink from anything. You know, you can put reds and whites together, you're not going to get fluorescent pink. But you know, it does depend partly on technology, what colors are available to you, and having that sensitivity. Like every year, who's it that does the color thing every year?
Pantone, is it Pantone?
Yeah. Every year there's that year's color.
Yes, it's gray and yellow this year.
You see them in fashion, you know, that kind of thing.
Sure.
You know, people should. You know, I think what Janine has just said about the color, it's really important to become, in terms of us learning about art and being critical and kind of analyzing it to some degree, it's really crucial to recognize that those colors play this kind of role. Yeah, he's used a very, very limited palette for most of his work, not entirely, but to a great degree.
Yeah. I know Candy is an artist and in her own right, and she also has a very distinctive palette. So, and it's a very culturally rich palette. And so I think that, you know, you get used to working in the color field that you feel conveys the most meaning when you're painting. And I think you've talked about that too with the docents before, and I know we have to go. But you've talked about that before with docents, and that the idea of making art, the actual act of making it and then separating that from the finished product and what the product is. And I think Pollock's an excellent example of that. We should have had Jason and his desire for his for performance art join us on this one. So we'll kind of experiment in April and see if this time of day works. I mean, we have a wonderful core of folks that are able to join us. And so, you know, we'd love to keep providing for them, but I also would love to expand it as well. So. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much. We'll end up with Max's slide. And thanks again. We'll see you next week.